Hey guys, what's up? Today I want to show you what was the very first JRPG released on every single console. So if you're curious to know what was the JRPG scene back then at the very beginning of each console, well, stay and find out. Now, I already made a video for PlayStation and another one for Sega 3 years ago. I will be including those videos today. So let's begin. Alright, we're gonna start with
Nintendo! Woohoo!
On the NES, we've got the Deadly Towers. Deadly Towers isn't what most people will call nowadays an RPG, but back then it was considered as such. Heck, it has more RPG elements than Zelda. Unfortunately, this game is beyond terrible, and it's perhaps the worst RPG on the NES. It was developed by some weird-ass nobody companies called Lenar and Tamtex. Yeah, it was actually going to be called Hell's Bells, but of course North America wouldn't tolerate such an overly offensive title to their beloved Christians back then. Well, I think Hell's Bells was a great title for this piece of trash, cause it pretty much resembles playing a game from hell! I'd use this junk to torture all sinners if I was goddamn Lucifer, forcing them to play it all day long. This action RPG was not released in Europe, you lucky sons of Should I even explain what's it about? You go to a ginormous tower navigating with bad controls, poor AI, and terrible hit detection. There you go, that probably sounds appealing enough for you. What a terrible way to start in JRPGs for Nintendo of America. Why the hell didn't we get Dragon Warrior first? It was released first in Japan. But no, instead we had to wait 3 years to see the light. Instead we got Hell's Bells, aka Deadly Towers, a deadly RPG from hell. Moving on to, oh man, Draken on the Super Nintendo. Originally, this game was a point-and-click adventure for computer systems developed by French studio Infogrames. Some douchebags in Kemco of Japan apparently really liked it and decided to twist its pure and innocent nature into a sickened abomination. Some kind of real-time strategy JRPG. The worst one on the Super Nintendo, to be honest. It's one of the earliest games in the genre with a 3D overworld navigation that obviously sucks bananas! You play as a bunch of generic and boring Western RPG looking characters in a bizarre medieval setting. The goal is to reach places like ruins to perform investigations while fighting enemies. Combat is pathetic here, so pathetic that it makes me want to play Deadly Towers instead. You barely understand what's going on or what you need to do. Sure, eventually you find out, but why would you? I mean, just look at it! Does this look like something you'd want to play? You know what, don't answer. Next is a Nintendo 64 with Quest 64. Man, what is it with Nintendo launching bad JRPGs in North America? Well, it wasn't exactly a launch. For 2 years, no RPGs were developed for the system. Quest 64, however, had potential. It is an RPG where you follow the adventure of Brian, a novice mage. His quest is to find his missing father, who is looking for a thief who stole an important magical book, so you go around while a sadistic camera torments you during your journey. Controls, I guess they were acceptable back in 1998, but not today. Combat starts with you locked in a limited area. If you're away from the enemy, you gotta move closer to them for melee attacks. It's played in turns with some real-time elements as in battle flows, no matter what you do. It's boring, but it isn't terrible. This game was mediocre at best, and it obviously didn't age well. At least it's far better than Draken or Deadly Towers, but it's just a sorry excuse for an RPG. I'm surprised Japan released it first in Europe and North America, waiting almost an entire year to release it in their territory. The truth is, it did fairly well in sales overseas at first, so I guess they didn't care less about the mixed to negative reviews. Money was all that mattered, apparently. For the GameCube, we've got Lost Kingdoms. Finally a good JRPG, as the first one released for Nintendo home console. 7 months after the GameCube's release, From Software decided to be the first one to release a JRPG for it. Lost Kingdoms is pretty good. It revolves around Princess Katia trying to save her kingdom from a horrible black fog. To do this, she'll start a journey and travel to different locations using a runestone, also in order to find her missing father, the king. The same runestone is the one she uses to summon monsters bound to spell cards. Some of them will fight on their own, while others become weapons or armor for her to use in real time. This is a really solid game, challenging, well designed, fun to play, and a breath of fresh air after 3 failure JRPGs on Nintendo's previous consoles. Moving on to the Wii with Super Paper Mario. The first 2 Paper Mario games have been very successful, so Intelligent Systems decided to release the 3rd game in the series as the very first JRPG release for the Wii. It sold well and it did alright in reviews, but its major problem was the change in design. It was no longer a turn-based RPG in 2D, instead it was an action RPG playing more like a platformer, switching constantly from 2D to 3D points of view. For some, this game was an acquired taste, and I can see why. First time I played it, it didn't really grab me, and I thought the mechanics were very tedious. Today, I have a little bit more appreciation for it, but it's honestly inferior to its 2 great predecessors. Still a fun game to play, I guess, but not what most JRPG fans were expecting for the first game in the genre to be released on the Wii. Japan got luckier with the masterpiece sequel to Fire Emblem Path of Radiance Radiant Dawn as the first one, released a couple of months before, but we didn't get it until November of 2007. If only we had gotten this one sooner. Next is the Wii U with Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate. Barely any JRPGs were developed for the Wii U. Nobody wanted to waste their time with a console that was failing in the market already from day one. Excellent games were released for it, that's for sure, but JRPGs? Nope, barely anything. So a year after the console's release, Capcom decided to port Monster Hunter 3, originally released on the Wii back in 2009. They did a port of it first to the 3DS, so to support the Wii U, the legendary game also came to it a year later. I'm no fan of this game, I played the original on the Wii and couldn't get into it. I'm not really a Monster Hunter guy, so I passed on its 2 ports. But hey, at least the Wii U also got a decent JRPG as its first, right? Next, the Nintendo Switch with I Am Setsuna. Unless you consider Breath of the Wild as an RPG, then I Am Setsuna is the first one released on the Switch. I haven't played Breath, so I can't really tell, so I'm going with Setsuna. Obviously, this was a re-release of a game that had been already published for the PS Vita, Windows and PS4 a year before. We never got the PS Vita version. So Nintendo and Square Enix decided to make Setsuna a launch title for the Switch. That's right, released on the same day as the console. No physical version was there for overseas regions, just the Japanese and the Chinese one with the English subtitles. A turn-based RPG following the sacrificial pilgrimage of Setsuna, accompanied by her loyal bodyguards in the harsh, cold and snowy regions of their world. I love this game and I strongly recommend it every time I can. Another great launch for the genre on a Nintendo console. Let's go back to the portable systems with the Game Boy and the Final Fantasy Legend. For a short time, the Game Boy saw no RPGs upon its release, not until halfway through December when Squaresoft launched their very first Saga game. 10 months later, it was decided to be called as the Final Fantasy Legend of its North American release. Europe wouldn't get it until its release 30 years later on the Switch, damn! First of all, they changed the name to take advantage of the popularity of Final Fantasy in the West. Saga was a pretty generic name over here, and it meant nothing special for us. Second, there were no JRPGs released over here for a long time, so it was a good idea to take advantage of that. The game was commercially successful, selling over 1 million copies in both regions. Next is the Game Boy Color with Power Quest. A couple of months after the release of the Game Boy Color, Capcom and Sunsoft partnered for the release of Power Quest, a hybrid video game combining RPG and fighting. In this town, people play games and they're called modelers. There's a new tournament starting soon, so your character decides to participate. First, you choose the type of robot you'll use for the fights, and you can change it at any time. There's no experience points here, only credits that you get when fighting enemies. So you go around with the goal of playing friendly matches with anyone you encounter until you get more and more credits to buy more and more parts. Parts are used to perform special moves when fighting, and that's about it. Great music, good controls, but honestly, it's very repetitive and very challenging. Still, an original idea like this, as the first JRPG released overseas for the Game Boy Color, I can't complain. Moving on to the Game Boy Advance with Mega Man Battle Network. Actually, the first JRPG released for the Game Boy Advance was Monster Guardians, but it was only in Japan! However, that very same day, Mega Man Battle Network was released over there. It took over 7 months for it to reach our lands, but it was the start of a legendary successful series of RPGs on the GBA. I've only played the first game, but people told me it's not the best one. Through this, I thought combat was pretty unique and interesting. It has some strategic mechanics in there, but it's an action RPG where you need to react quickly, moving Mega Man around, so it's very intuitive. Unfortunately, I think some of the puzzles make it tedious for me. Overall, however, I think it was a good start in the JRPG universe on the Game Boy Advance. For the Nintendo DS, we've got Advance Wars Dual Strike. The Nintendo DS was released on November 21 of 2004 in North America, December 2 for Japan. It wouldn't see its first JRPG until the third entry in the Advance Wars series 8 months later. It is a continuation of the previous 2 games on the GBA, so my guess is that you do need to play those to understand this one. Problem is, I've never played it! I've never been a fan of the series since I played those 2 first games, but in case you didn't know what they're about, well, they're basically strategy RPGs developed by Intelligent Systems, the team behind the Fire Emblem and Paper Mario series, but they involve micromanagement of generic units like soldiers or tanks. I'm more of a characters guy, so there wasn't a lot to keep me going with them. Feel free to share your opinion on this third game in the comments if you played it. Finally, on the 3DS, Tales of the Abyss. 3 months after the Nintendo 3DS release, Tales of the Abyss was ported to it. Everybody else will get that version 5 months later, except North America. We got it until February next year. Barely anything changed from the original PS2 version to this one, so I'm not sure why it took so long for Bandai Namco of America to release it here. Honestly, I think it's a good port, even though I prefer the original version. I think I like action RPGs way more on my TV than on a portable system with a not so great joystick. But hey, if you don't have a PS2 and you really want to play one of the most popular Tales games out there, I do recommend the 3DS version. If you've played the original and want to try this one expecting new stuff, you might be a little disappointed. Alright, we're gonna start with the Master System with Miracle Warrior Seal of the Dark Lord. This game was first released for several computer systems until its port to the Master System in 1987. 3 months later, it was released in North America, making it the first JRPG to be localized here. Not a launch title, but definitely the first one of its kind. It's a turn-based RPG, a little bit slow and boring to be honest. What little I played left me with no desire to come back, so it isn't something that I can actually recommend. It's got some interesting features like the navigation system and the fact that you can see several screens at a time, but overall it's not something to be excited about. It's an okay RPG, I guess, decent only for its time. Now for the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive, we've got Phantasy Star 2. Following the success of the first Phantasy Star on the Master System in 1988 outside Japan, the Genesis came out and brought its sequel the next year as the very first JRPG localized in the West. It also became a commercial success, although still being a very hard game to play and navigate, probably now more than its predecessor. First-person dungeon crawler was gone, and instead it introduced really long and tedious dungeons without a map. We all know nowadays this game is a total grind fest, but it's still a great game nonetheless. The Sega CD. We've got Lunar the Silver Star. The Sega CD, also known as the Mega CD, was a huge thing when it first came out, and although it focused more on other types of games, exploiting the compact disc features of its time, particularly with the cutscenes, it also had some RPGs on it. Most of them sadly were never released outside Japan, but we still got a few. The very first one was Lunar the Silver Star by Game Arts, which would later become a huge classic, remade and ported to several different consoles. It was a charming and traditional turn-based RPG, but with characters fighting at the right side of the screen, sprites looked small but beautiful at the same time, and it had a story full of charisma. The game was brought to North America by Working Designs a year and a half later after its original release. If it wasn't for them, I'm pretty sure we would never have gotten this amazing version. Moving on to the Sega Saturn with Virtual Highlight. It's sad to see how one of the worst RPGs ever made on a Sega console was the very first one released on the Saturn. The Highlight franchise made its debut on the arcade and computer systems in the 80s, but as soon as it was brought to the NES, gamers and critics trashed it. I'll never understand why they decided to remake it for the Sega Saturn, only to fail miserably again. This time it was even worse. I can't believe an action RPG like this exists, with full 3D graphics and a digitized dude that was probably coerced into acting for the main character. This game is horrible, and it shouldn't even be acknowledged as an RPG, so if you want something more traditional, feel free to say Mystaria: The Realms of Lore is the true first JRPG released outside Japan back in 1996. Can't talk about it since I have never played it. Next up is the Dreamcast, with Evolution: The World of Sacred Device. This was the start of a two-part game, as it is technically an RPG cut in half. The World of Sacred Device was the first part, and it wasn't exactly successful, but at least it became a cult classic later on, nowadays being more of a hidden gem. It's a traditional turn-based RPG with a story that's mainly for kids, so it's kinda ideal for young beginners to take on the world of role-playing games. However, it's not that good in my opinion, and I think games like Lunar are more befitting for newcomers to the genre. Evolution is the earliest JRPG on the system that was released outside Japan. I said it wasn't that good, but that doesn't make it bad. It's pretty decent, and it's cool to have it as one of the earliest JRPGs on the Dreamcast. Last but not least, the Game Gear. We've got Crystal Warriors. It is the first JRPG released on the Sega's first portable console back in 1991. Before this game, there was Dragon Crystal released in 1990, but that's just a roguelike with barely any RPG elements on it. In any case, it is officially the first JRPG made for the console that got a localization outside Japan. While it may be true that the first JRPG released for the PlayStation was From Software's Kingsfield at the end of 1994, fact is, we never got it. That's right, this game was never released outside Japan. Then there was Arc the Lad, released on June 1995, but again, only in Japan. That is until 2002, when Working Designs localized it along the other 3 games on this collection. Kingsfield 2, released in 1995, was localized as if it was the first Kingsfield ever. It caused a lot of confusion, as you can imagine. But oh well, that is the very first JRPG released and localized for the PlayStation. Which means we never got a single RPG during an entire year. Weird, huh? And to be honest, it wasn't exactly a good premiere. Kingsfield 2, a first-person dungeon crawler, was not successful and almost nobody outside Japan gave a damn about it. Brutally hard, The hardest PS1 JRPG ever in my opinion, but definitely not bad for those who are into these kinds of games. In any case, this was the first JRPG we got for the mighty PlayStation. For the PS2, there's Eternal Ring. Once again, From Software takes the ring with its initial release of Eternal Ring. Yet another slow and boring first-person dungeon crawler. Nowhere near as hard as any of the King's Field titles, however, instead a friendly approach to the genre and the developer's style. This was a launch title actually, meaning you could buy this game right when the PlayStation 2 was released. Other initial JRPGs were Evergrace, an action RPG also by From Software, and Orphan: Scion of Sorcery. All three extremely mediocre games, with nothing special to mention, just titles that were kinda there to continue the PlayStation legacy of role-playing video games. Eternal Ring has gained more fans over the course of time, but there aren't nearly enough people to remember it or even care about it. So yeah, let's move on. PS3, we got Enchanted Arms. Yeah, you guessed it. From Software strikes once again with a launch title for the Xbox 360, now ported to the PlayStation 3 when it was fairly released. Enchanted Arms, however, is nothing to forget about. It's a hidden gem. Not exactly underrated, but a nice turn-based RPG with a very unique battle system that grabbed my attention the moment I started playing it. Sure, the story doesn't stand out and the grasp of originality is long gone from other areas, but at least it's 10 times better than all the previous From Software games in this video. Sad to say though, it wasn't very well received and it stayed at the company's shadow for quite a while until people like me started rescuing it. Truth of the matter is the game failed and obscured the path for other JRPGs on the system until From Software brought a cult classic to save their asses. Moving on to the PS4, yeah, the first one was Final Fantasy XIV, but that's an MMORPG, so that doesn't count. Real first JRPG was Natural Doctrine. With a console that's still releasing JRPGs nowadays, I was very curious to find out which one had been the first on the system. Natural Doctrine was originally planned for the PlayStation 4, but it was first released on the PS3 and the PS Vita. By far, one of the hardest strategy RPGs ever made, and one confusing hellhole that no matter how much I tried, I never managed to get into. For this to be one of the very few JRPGs on the PS4 during 2014 was such a disgrace. Again, Sony let us down with a title that was just not worth our money. It was just a damn mess of a game and nobody wanted to play it since the PS3 era. It was too difficult and hard to get into, even for Japanese players, who were the first one to complain about it. Fortunately, they added an easy mode on July 2014, so more gamers could start from a careful distance. Natural Doctrine was supposed to be a launch title, but it got delayed for some reason. I wish it could have been delayed forever, so we could have gotten a much better RPG instead as a first to the PlayStation 4. Alright, now to the portable consoles, the PSP. Yeah, well, the reason I'm putting both games as the first JRPGs released and localized for the PSP is because the localization was yet another mess. They're both Falcom RPGs of their nowadays popular franchise The Legend of Heroes, also part of a saga called the Gagar Trilogy. Prophecy of the Moonlight Witch was the first one released on September 16, 2004 in Japan, but we didn't get it until June 20, 2006, almost 2 years after its original release. Wanna know what happened in between? A Tear of Vermilion, which was the second one, but North America got it as the first one, hence the name The Legend of Heroes 2 on Prophecy of the Moonlight Witch. Whew! Vermilion was originally released in Japan on June 2, 2005. On November of the same year, Bandai localized it to North America. Yup, what a mess. But anyway, these two games were originally computer RPGs from 1996, released 2 years later for the PlayStation. Of course, we never got any versions until the PSP arrived. They screwed up the localization, not only with the dates, mind you, but also with the horrible translation. But hey, at least we got them! And just for the curious mind, Kingdom of Paradise, an action RPG, was localized and published the exact same day as Vermilion. Last but not least, the PS Vita with Ragnarok Odyssey. It plays similar to the Monster Hunter series, but much faster and more anime-styled. There is a story, of course, but it's a quest-driven action RPG that notoriously focuses on its gameplay mechanics. It was also meant to be played online, but the offline mode was just as great. Anyway, another note for the curious mind is that Disgaea 3 was released and localized before Ragnarok Odyssey, but that was just a port. Natural Doctrine and Ragnarok were not ports since they were originally developed for the PS4 and the PS Vita, respectively. Disgaea 3 could be argued as being the very first JRPG we got on the Vita, being a real launch title as a matter of fact, but like I said, it's just a port. Hell, not even that, it's just a re-release! But anyway, it's a solid strategy RPG, a good title. Some people might say it's even better than Ragnarok Odyssey as a first JRPG for the console, but that's just a matter of opinions. In the end, up to you whether you consider this game as the very first JRPG for the PS Vita or not. Oh, and by the way, we've got Demon's Souls on the PS5 as the first one, November 12, 2020 for North America, and the rest of the world, November 19. I'm pretty sure most of you couldn't care less about Microsoft, but may still be curious, so here are the first JRPGs released for each Xbox console out there. In case you were wondering about the TurboGrafx 16, no, don't worry, I didn't forget about that console. The first JRPG release for that one was Dungeon Explorer on March 1989 in Japan and November of the same year in North America. Developed by Atlus, oh yeah. That's it everybody, thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends. See you next time!